If you walk into, well, almost any restaurant today and you just observe the room, you are going to witness this really highly specific, very modern kind of silence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's eerie when you really notice it.
Right, because you'll see a table of four, maybe it's a family, and every single person is just looking down. Their faces are illuminated by that pale blue glow of a smartphone.
Yeah, they're physically occupying the exact same booth, but psychologically, I mean, they're operating in entirely different time zones.
Exactly. In a world that's utterly dominated by screens and this, endless cascading avalanche of information, true, raw, unmediated human connection is becoming shockingly rare.
It really is. We are practically starving for friction, like we are desperate for actual human contact.
And the sources we're unpacking today point to what is basically a radical antidote, because today we are doing a deep dive into the crucible of group therapy and psychoeducational groups.
Because in this era of digital isolation, a therapy group is one of the very last remaining spaces that actually demands you look another human being in the eye.
It's a profound shift in how we interact. The paradox we are living through is that, well, we have never had more tools for communication.
Right. But the data on depression and profound social isolation, I mean, particularly among younger demographics, is pointing to a massive crisis of disconnection.
Yeah, and Irvin Yalom, who is one of the foundational figures we're looking at today, notes this explicitly.
He really does. He points out that the digital mediation of our lives is actually stripping away the interpersonal feedback loops that we actually need to develop a healthy sense of self.
Because when you sit in a circle of chairs with 8 other people, you can't just swipe away from an uncomfortable emotion. You can't filter your reaction, right?
Exactly. That unavoidable presence is what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
So for this deep dive, we're pulling from a massive stack of source material to really understand the architecture of this process. We've got Gerald Corey's theory and practice of group counseling, which gives us the structural blueprint.
And we are integrating Yalom's theory and practice of group psychotherapy, which explores those really deep existential dynamics of human interaction.
Plus, we have some specialized government protocols from SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and some highly targeted research by Vanilla on how transactional analysis functions within a group setting.
So the goal here is to decode how this actually works. Because I think there is a common misconception that group therapy is merely, an administrative cost-saving measure.
Oh, totally. The assumption is usually like, well, the clinic is short-staffed, so they just cram 10 people into a room to save billable hours.
Right. But the literature reveals that group work isn't just some diluted form of individual therapy. It is a uniquely powerful engine for human change, with its own entirely distinct mechanisms.
So to understand those mechanisms, we really have to look at the unique curative forces that a group possesses, right?
Yeah, because in one-on-one therapy, the relationship is inherently asymmetrical. The therapist is the designated professional in the room, and you are the client seeking help.
But in a group, you're surrounded by peers. So the power dynamic shifts entirely.
Exactly. You are experiencing affiliation, peer support, and crucially, peer confrontation. Yalom points out that a group frequently functions as a substitute family.
Okay, let me stop you right there because I really want to unpack that idea of the substitute family. I want to understand the actual mechanics of how that heals someone.
Sure. Yeah. Let's walk through it.
So if someone grew up in a highly dysfunctional household where, say, their role was always the peacemaker-like, the person who had to manage their parents' volatile emotions, they're naturally going to recreate that exact same behavior when they walk into a therapy group, right?
Oh, 100%. Because the group is essentially a microcosm of society. People inevitably bring their ingrained relational patterns into the room.
So if 2 other group members start arguing, this person is going to instantly try to de-escalate it.
That is precisely the mechanism. But here is where the actual healing happens. Unlike their actual family of origin, where that peacemaking behavior was, perhaps demanded or exploited, the substitute family of the group will actually notice it.
Because it's being guided by a trained leader.
Right. The group will point it out. They will say something like, notice how you just rushed in to save us from an argument. You don't have to do that here.
Wow. So the client is recreating their past in the here and now of the room, and the group provides this safe environment to experiment with a different response.
Exactly. They can actually experience what it feels like to just let an argument happen without taking responsibility for fixing it.
It basically functions as a behavioral laboratory. You get to test drive a new version of yourself with real-time feedback.
That's a great way to put it. But, this highly structured, feedback-driven model didn't just appear out of thin air. The history here is actually really surprising.
Yeah, I was shocked by the history. When we think of therapy, we usually picture, I don't know, Freud and the psychoanalytic couch. But the origins of psychoeducational group work are vastly different.
Completely different. It completely upends our modern assumptions. So in the 1940s, there was this psychiatrist named Maxwell Jones. He found himself dealing with large populations of psychiatric patients, and he's essentially turned to a lecture format.
A lecture format for psychiatric patients.
Yeah, he would gather massive groups of patients and just speak to them for 3 hours a week, explaining the physiological realities of the nervous system and the biology behind their symptoms. He was basically demystifying their illness.
3 hours of lecturing on the nervous system sounds like a university biology seminar, not a therapy session.
Right. And if we go back even further, to the 1930s, a practitioner named L. Cody Marsh was doing something similar. He organized literal classes for his patients.
Classes?
Yeah, she delivered lectures, assigned them homework, and get this, even handed out grades based on their participation and understanding of the material.
Oh my gosh. Receiving a failing grade on processing your own psychological trauma is just a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is, but it illustrates a massive divide in the architecture of group work that our sources really emphasize. We have to separate the two main pillars here.
Right, the counseling groups versus psychoeducational groups.
Exactly.
So from my reading of Corey, a counseling group is highly problem-oriented. It's focused on the immediate, conscious thoughts and behaviors of the members. It isn't psychoanalysis. You aren't lying on a couch trying to reconstruct your entire personality from early childhood.
No, not at all. Corey defines counseling groups as growth-oriented. They're designed for individuals who are, generally functioning well, but are facing a situational crisis, or maybe a temporary interpersonal conflict.
Like a major life transition.
Right. Think of someone navigating a brutal divorce or someone facing a massive career collapse. The primary objective is to help the members access and utilize the internal strength and coping mechanisms they already possess.
Mechanisms that have just been temporarily obscured by whatever current crisis they're in?
Exactly.
Okay, so the counseling group is about processing the friction of daily life. Now, contrast that with the psychoeducational group. These sound much closer to that Maxwell Jones model.
They are. They're structured around a highly specific central theme.
Right, so you might enroll in an anger management group, or a group for individuals newly diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, or maybe a group focused on the transition into retirement. And these are often heavily manualized, right? They operate on a curriculum.
They do. And the goal of that curriculum is fundamentally preventative. Psychoeducational groups integrate factual, didactic information like literally teaching the physiological triggers of a panic attack with practical skill-building exercises.
So the intention is to provide members with robust coping mechanisms to prevent a mild psychological disturbance from metastasizing into a severe clinical issue. But let me push back on this structure for a second. Because if a psychoeducational group relies on a curriculum, and if it involves a leader standing at the front of a room imparting information, we are essentially describing school.
Right, we are.
And for a massive portion of the population, a formal classroom was a site of profound trauma. I mean, if someone struggled with learning disabilities, or was constantly mocked by peers, or felt humiliated by teachers, wouldn't placing them in a psychoeducational group just immediately trigger all of that unresolved educational shame?
That is such a critical vulnerability in this model, and honestly, the SAM-HSA protocols address it extensively. If a facilitator simply mimics the environment of a traditional high school classroom, they will absolutely replicate that historical shame.
And then the members just shut down.
Exactly. They withdraw, or they become extremely defensive to protect themselves from that anticipated humiliation. Therefore, the leader has to completely re-engineer the delivery method.
So they can't just talk at the members.
No, they have to employ adult learning principles.
Meaning the information has to be immediately relevant to the problems the adult is currently facing, rather than just abstract theory.
Exactly that. The learning must be active, it must be experiential, and directly tied to their lived reality. Furthermore, the leader has to establish a culture where mockery is explicitly banned.
Well, that makes sense. So failure to understand a concept is treated as a natural part of the process, not some character flaw.
Right. The facilitator must be hypervigilant. If a group member suddenly disengages during a skill-building exercise, the leader has to recognize that this might not be resistance to the therapy itself.
It might just be an echo of a fourth-grade classroom where they were called on to read aloud and laughed at.
Precisely.
The group leader is essentially serving as a psychological bodyguard while simultaneously trying to deliver a curriculum.
That's a great analogy.
And that brings us to the actual mechanics of how you build that environment because, you can't just throw 8 strangers in a room, lock the door, and expect a supportive substitute family to magically form.
Oh, absolutely not. Human beings in an unstructured group setting can easily devolve into chaos, scapegoating, or tribalism.
Which is why the orientation and contracting phase, what Corey refers to as stage 1 or pre-group issues, is arguably the most vital part of the entire process.
The foundation of the group dictates its eventual success or failure, period. A competent leader has to spend significant time explicitly exploring the members' expectations, their underlying fears, and their misconceptions about what therapy actually is before any deep emotional work begins.
And a massive part of that orientation has to be a blunt conversation about the risks involved, right? Because confidentiality in a group setting is incredibly fragile.
It is extremely fragile.
Because in individual therapy, your secrets are locked in a room with a licensed professional who is bound by strict ethical and legal codes. But in a group, your deepest vulnerabilities are being shared with a plumber, a school teacher, and an accountant who just happened to be sitting next to you.
Yeah, and placing that profound responsibility on a layman is a big deal. The leader is essentially teaching the participants how to be effective group members.
And this process of establishing the rules of engagement brings us to some really fascinating insights from Vanella's research on transactional analysis, or TA, within groups.
TA relies really heavily on the concept of the contract.
I found the TA framework incredibly compelling. So, transactional analysis posits that we all operate from different ego states at various times: the parent, the adult, and the child.
Right.
And as I understand it, the parent state is the internalized voice of authority, the rules, and the judgments we absorbed growing up. The child state contains our historical emotions, our impulses, and spontaneous reactions. And the adult state is the rational, objective processor of reality in the present moment.
Exactly. And Vanella argues that the initial counseling contract, like the explicit agreement of what the group is going to do, must be negotiated strictly in the adult ego state.
Why is that so critical?
Well, the necessity of the adult ego state during contracting just cannot be overstated. Because if a client enters the group in their child state, they might agree to the rules merely to please the therapist.
Seeking approval the way a child seeks approval from a teacher.
Right. Or if they enter in the parent state, they might view the group as a place to judge and correct the behavior of all the other members.
So by requiring the adult state, the facilitator ensures that every member is rationally and objectively consenting to the work ahead. They actually understand their responsibilities.
Exactly.
Vanella also makes a distinction in this contract that I think redefines the entire purpose of therapy. Because the goal of the group, according to the TA framework, is care rather than cure.
Care rather than cure, yes.
We so often conceptualize therapy through a medical lens. You have a broken bone, a doctor sets it, you are cured. You have a psychological issue, the therapist applies a technique, you are cured.
But psychological care doesn't work like that. Care is an ongoing process of facilitation. It is about untangling communication.
And that leads directly into one of the most memorable concepts in the sources, the stroke economy.
The stroke economy is such a brilliant lens for analyzing human interaction. In TA, a stroke is defined as any unit of human recognition.
Okay, so a stroke can be positive, like a compliment, an expression of affection, a moment of validation.
Yes, or it can be negative, an insult, a criticism, a look of disgust.
Right.
The fundamental premise is that human beings require strokes for psychological survival in the exact same way we require food for biological survival. We are desperate for recognition.
So if we imagine this as like an emotional stock market, people are constantly trading for these units of recognition. And if someone cannot figure out how to acquire positive strokes, they won't just accept isolation.
Never. They will actively provoke negative strokes because receiving an insult still proves that you exist.
Wow. It is still a form of connection, albeit a totally toxic one.
And that is the absolute tragedy of maladaptive behavior. But a group setting brilliantly exposes these economic strategies. The facilitator and the members can observe, in real time, the games and individual plays to secure their strokes.
So, is someone constantly playing the victim to elicit pity? Or is someone always aggressively challenging the leader to command the room's attention?
Exactly. The group environment makes the stroke economy visible, which allows the members to recognize their own patterns and consciously choose to seek healthier forms of validation.
But navigating all these really complex interactions requires a leader who is highly adaptable. Corey draws this fascinating distinction in the text between evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence.
The difference between those two concepts is essentially the difference between rigidity and responsiveness.
Okay, explain that.
Well, evidence-based practice relies on techniques and interventions that have been rigorously validated through randomized clinical trials. It's applying the established science of what is known to work for a specific diagnosis.
So, to use a culinary analogy, evidence-based practice is like following a recipe perfectly because a master chef wrote it down and proved it yields a good cake.
That's a perfect analogy. Now, practice-based evidence, on the other hand, is tasting the soup as it simmers.
Ah.
It's throwing the recipe aside because the tomatoes you were using today are way more acidic than usual, so you have to add sugar to balance it out. Practice-based evidence relies on the real-time, unfolding results of the specific people in the room to inform the next intervention.
So the group itself becomes a living, breathing research experiment, and the members' actual progress dictates the direction of the therapy.
Exactly. Operating in that practice-based mode demands immense clinical intuition. The facilitator must constantly evaluate whether an intervention is actually landing.
And I imagine that requirement for extreme flexibility becomes infinitely more complex when we change the demographics of the room. Like when we transition from adults who can conceptualize abstract theories like ego states and stroke economies to populations whose brains are fundamentally operating on totally different developmental levels.
Oh, absolutely. Which means we really need to look at how this crucible is customized for children and adolescents.
Right. Because if you sit 6 third graders in a circle and ask them to rationally discuss their maladaptive behavioral patterns from an adult ego state, you are going to get absolute chaos.
Utter chaos. They do not possess the cognitive architecture for that kind of direct, abstract confrontation. Children will entirely shut down if subjected to the intense verbal processing utilized in adult groups.
So what's the alternative?
Their primary language is not verbal reasoning, it is play. This is why the sources heavily emphasize play group therapy, which is grounded in person-centered principles for younger populations.
Play therapy utilizes the child's natural mode of expression to process emotional distress.
Exactly.
The sources actually outline how child-centered play therapy is frequently deployed in school settings, and the focus is exclusively on the present moment and the child's immediate feelings. And importantly, the child directs the session, not the therapist.
That's a key distinction.
There is this incredibly compelling case study in the text regarding the use of play therapy with African American boys in an elementary school setting. The researchers found that allowing these boys to utilize culturally relevant play items like specific puppets, games, and art materials actually honored their cultural worldview.
It provided a proxy. They didn't have to look an adult in the eye and say, I feel powerless. They could act out a scenario with the materials that communicated that exact feeling, and the therapist could validate it.
Which resulted in a massive increase in their self-confidence.
Right, because the proxy is essential. The toy absorbs the anxiety of the direct interaction.
Wow.
And then, as children mature slightly, moving into middle childhood, the Adlerian approach becomes highly effective.
Right, Alfred Adler's psychological framework. That's built on the premise that human behavior is profoundly motivated by a need for social belonging and our position within our early social structures, particularly our families.
Yes, so an Adlerian group leader will place a really heavy focus on analyzing the family constellation and birth order.
So the mechanics of the session change. Instead of asking a 10-year-old to articulate their generalized anxiety, the facilitator might ask very structured questions about their reality, like, who is the favorite in your house? Who gets yelled at the most? Are you the oldest child who has to be responsible for everyone, or the youngest who feels ignored?
Exactly. By mapping out the family structure, the leader uncovers the child's underlying belief about their own worth and where they fit into the world.
Because the Adlerian perspective views a child's misbehavior or their withdrawal not as a pathology to be cured, but as a symptom of deep discouragement.
Right. The child has fundamentally lost faith in their ability to belong in a useful, positive way. So the core function of the Adlerian group is encouragement.
The group acts as a counterbalance to that crushing sense of inferiority. The members validate each other's worth, slowly rebuilding the discouraged child's belief that they have a rightful, valued place in the community.
It's beautiful work. But then the developmental window shifts again rapidly. When those children enter adolescence, their psychological needs just mutate entirely.
The teenage brain is notoriously volatile. I mean, they are undergoing massive neurological pruning, a massive surge of hormones, and this desperate biological drive to separate from their parents.
Which is precisely why adolescence is the optimal developmental stage for group therapy.
Really? Optimal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Teenagers are biologically wired to pull away from familial authority and orient themselves entirely toward their peer group. A therapy group harnesses that biological imperative.
It provides a contained, safe laboratory where they can test their shifting perception of reality, interrogate the values they inherited from their parents, and, I guess, discover that the profound self-doubt they're experiencing is not uniquely theirs.
That shared experience of self-doubt is vital. It's life-saving.
I was initially really surprised to see the existential approach recommended for teenagers in our sources. Existentialism sounds so heavy. You imagine a group of old academics debating the void and the meaninglessness of the universe.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive. But the texts point out that teenagers are actually actively drowning in existential anxiety. They are waking up to the reality of their own mortality, the frightening expansiveness of their future, and the terrifying responsibility of defining their own meaning.
Right. There is a deeply moving example in the text of a middle school social worker running a bereavement group for young teens who have lost a parent. That is raw, fundamental existential work happening during lunch period in a junior high school.
It really is. Teenagers are absolutely wrestling with the ultimate concerns of existence, often way more intensely than adults who have learned to kind of numb themselves to those realities. But simultaneously, teenagers are highly pragmatic and action-oriented. They want immediate results.
And this is where the integration of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, rational emotive behavior therapy, RABT, and reality therapy becomes crucial.
Exactly.
The reality therapy framework outlined in the text seems just perfectly engineered to bypass teenage resistance. It utilizes a system called WDEP, wants, doing, evaluation, and planning.
It's so effective because it strips away all the clinical jargon. The facilitator simply asks the teenager, what is it that you truly want? What are you actually doing right now to get it? Let's evaluate. Is skipping class and getting high actually moving you closer to what you want? If it isn't, let's create a plan that works.
It is brilliant because it completely removes the I am the adult authority figure telling you that your behavior is bad dynamic. It just asks them to look at their own quality world.
Right, the internal picture album.
Yeah, the texts describe this as the internal picture album everyone carries in their head of what their ideal life looks like. The therapist just holds up the teen's current behavior against their own picture album and asks, is this a match?
It's completely non-judgmental.
But I have a significant logistical question here. When you are treating adolescents, they do not exist in a vacuum. They are tethered to parents, school administrators, and the legal system. How on earth does a facilitator maintain the sanctity and confidentiality of the group when the real world constantly has jurisdiction over the members?
That is the hardest part. The SAMA-HSA protocols are incredibly explicit about this. Treating minors is a labyrinth of legal and ethical complexities.
I can imagine.
A group leader is not merely navigating teenage angst. They are legally bound by mandates regarding statutory rape laws, infectious disease reporting, child abuse disclosure requirements, and parental consent laws, all while trying to, schedule sessions around biology class.
Right, because if a teenager discloses physical abuse during a session, the facilitator is a mandated reporter. They must break the confidentiality of the group and involve authorities.
Exactly. This reality requires highly specialized, population-specific training. You cannot simply take a model designed for adults, miniaturize it, and apply it to 15-year-olds. The boundaries are fundamentally different.
And if an adolescent fails to develop those vital coping mechanisms, if they don't get the opportunity to evaluate their quality world and learn how to manage their existential anxiety, they frequently carry that deficit into adulthood.
They almost always do.
And often, they turn to chemical substances as a substitute for those missing coping skills. Which brings us to perhaps the most challenging application of group work: the treatment of substance abuse and addiction.
Addiction is arguably the ultimate test of the group therapy model.
Why is that?
Because the reason group work is considered the treatment of choice for substance use disorders is deeply tied to the nature of the illness itself. Addiction systematically destroys relational capacity. It erodes trust, intimacy, and connection before, during, and long after the active chemical use.
So because the disease thrives in isolation and deception, the healing process must occur in connection.
Exactly. Sammy Chase emphasizes that recovery requires the construction of a culture of recovery.
Now, to clarify for everyone listening, we are making a distinct differentiation here. We are not discussing 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. Those are peer-led, self-help fellowships, and while they are an incredibly vital component of global recovery, our focus today is strictly on clinical therapeutic groups led by trained professionals.
Right, that's an important distinction. And the Sammy Chase source meticulously breaks this clinical landscape down into 5 distinct models of addiction groups.
Understanding these 5 models is essential because a client will typically progress through them chronologically as their brain chemistry stabilizes and their psychological resilience increases, right?
Yes, the journey begins with Model 1, the psychoeducational group.
So what happens there?
Well, in the very early stages of treatment, a client is often shrouded in profound denial. The objective here is not deep trauma processing. It is purely to expand their awareness of the severe medical, neurological, and psychological consequences of their substance use.
So the clinical goal is to move the client from a pre-contemplative state where they genuinely do not believe they have a problem to a state where they are actually ready to engage in recovery.
Exactly. Model 1 is the wake-up call. It's the factual reality check.
Okay, so once they are awake, they transition to Model 2, skills development groups.
Right. Because now that they recognize the need to stop, they realize they have absolutely no idea how to do it because their only tool for managing stress was the substance.
So this group is highly pragmatic. They are learning the literal mechanics of anger management, the physiological realities how to ride out a craving without acting on it, and even role-playing how to physically refuse a drink at a social event.
It's all about building a new toolkit.
Ah,
And once those foundational behavioral skills are established, the client can safely move to Model 3, cognitive behavioral groups.
and this is where the work deepens significantly.
It really does. We begin to examine the architecture of their cognition. CBT in this context is about identifying and rearranging the deeply ingrained maladaptive schemas and core beliefs that inevitably trigger the urge to use.
Like, if a client has a core belief that they are inherently worthless and destined to fail, any minor setback will be interpreted as confirmation of that worthlessness, leading directly to relapse.
Exactly. So the group challenges the evidence for those core beliefs.
They are essentially rewriting the software.
Yes, which leads to Model 4, support groups.
Now, this functions as a forum for maintaining daily chemical-free life, but it has a very specific mechanism, right? Because you can sit in an office and lie to an individual therapist who has never experienced addiction.
Oh, easily.
But you cannot sit in a circle of 10 other addicts and lie to them. They operate as a peer-driven lie detector test.
They really do. They know every excuse, every manipulation, and every justification because they have used them all themselves. The group ruthlessly but supportively debunks the client's self-deception.
And that profound level of peer accountability prepares the client for the deepest and most complex tier, Model 5, interpersonal process groups.
These groups are intense. They're reserved for clients who have achieved a solid, stable period of sobriety. Here, the focus shifts entirely away from the substance itself.
So what are they focusing on?
The group delves into the profound developmental arrests, the early childhood trauma, and the severe attachment wounds that the client was desperately attempting to self-medicate in the first place.
So they recreate their historical relational traumas in the here and now of the group, and under the highly skilled guidance of the therapist, they finally process and resolve them.
Exactly.
It is just a staggering journey. You are taking a human being from, here is a chart showing what alcohol does to your liver, all the way to, let's explore why the emotional neglect you suffered at age 6 makes you incapable of accepting love today.
It takes incredible courage. But navigating all 5 of these models requires overcoming a massive, omnipresent psychological barrier. And that barrier is shame.
Shame is the most toxic element in the ecosystem of addiction. Guilt is the feeling that you did something bad. Shame is the core conviction that you are bad.
Exactly. And the inherent danger of group therapy is that the very act of sitting in a circle and exposing your flaws can inadvertently magnify a client's shame. They feel highly scrutinized.
The SAMHSA text provides this masterful example of how a skilled facilitator must actively manage and neutralize this dynamic. Let's walk through that example because it perfectly illustrates the mechanism of clinical reframing.
Yeah, it's a perfect case study.
So imagine a group in session. Member A looks across the room at another participant, let's call her Sally, and says bluntly, "Sally, where were you last week? You didn't come to group."
Okay, now Sally, who is already drowning in the internal shame of her addiction and her unreliability, immediately processes this question as a hostile attack. Her internal narrative hears, "You are a failure. You aren't taking your recovery seriously. We are all judging you."
And if the facilitator remains silent in that moment, the damage is done. Sally's shame is validated, she will likely become highly defensive, and she may just abandon treatment entirely to escape the discomfort.
Which is why the facilitator must execute a clinical intervention. They step in and reframe the interaction by saying to member A, "I suspect your question reflects the feeling that you actually missed Sally last week and that you find the group experience more valuable when she is present."
It's an emotional jujitsu move. The leader intercepts an interaction that was interpreted as a shameful, critical attack and instantly translates it into a profound expression of care and belonging.
Because it probably was. And Sally doesn't hear that she is a failure. She hears that her presence is actually desired. She's valued by the community.
That specific mechanism of reframing builds relational competence. Over the course of months, accumulating these supportive, non-punitive interactions begins to slowly dissolve the toxic shame that has kept the client locked in their illness.
It's incredibly powerful. And another critical mechanism utilized extensively in addiction groups is motivational interviewing, or MI, which both Corey and Samukjesa highlight.
Right, because historically, addiction treatment often relied on aggressive, tear-them-down confrontation. MI takes the exact opposite approach.
It utilizes the client's own ambivalence. Instead of the therapist demanding, "You have to stop drinking," which instantly triggers the client to defend their drinking, the MI approach respects the hesitation.
So the leader might ask, what are the benefits you get from drinking and what are the costs? It creates a psychological space where the motivation to change is generated internally by the client, rather than being imposed as an external mandate by the therapist.
It is all about facilitating autonomy. The client must own the decision to change.
So we have spent this time thoroughly examining the intense, physical, here-and-now intimacy of the group process. We've talked about reading subtle body language, the impact of physical presence, the power of eye contact when reframing shame.
Right.
But we have to address the reality of the world we currently inhabit. How does any of this architectural theory translate to our modern landscape, where connection is increasingly filtered through fiber optic cables? This brings us to the digital frontier of group work.
And the landscape of psychotherapy is undergoing a truly seismic shift here. Yelm spends considerable time analyzing the explosive growth of video teleconference, or VTC, groups.
Because the transition from a physical circle of chairs in a clinic to a grid of faces on a computer screen is not merely a logistical change, it is a fundamental alteration of the psychological container.
It really is. Yelm actually equates this transition to the historical magnitude of moving from Freud's solitary couch to the very first group therapy circles. It fundamentally changes the rules of engagement.
Now, there are undeniable, massive benefits to this evolution. Geographic freedom is the most obvious. If you live in a deeply rural area with zero mental health infrastructure, or if you have a physical disability that makes travel difficult, you can now access highly specialized care from your living room.
It is a massive leap forward for health equity.
Absolutely. But beyond logistics, Yalom introduces a psychological concept that I found entirely counterintuitive. He calls it e-intimacy, electronic intimacy.
It completely challenges our assumptions. We naturally assume that placing a screen between two humans makes the interaction colder, more sterile, and more distant.
Right. That's the default assumption.
However, for a specific subset of clients, particularly those with severe social anxiety or deep-seated shame, the interpersonal distance created by the screen actually functions as a safety barrier.
So because they feel physically insulated from the immediate presence of others, their fear of judgment decreases.
Exactly. Consequently, they are often willing to take significantly greater interpersonal risks. They may disclose traumas faster and dive deeper into the emotional work than they ever would if they were physically trapped in a room with strangers.
The screen acts as a shield that paradoxically allows them to be more vulnerable.
Yes, but the dangers of this medium are profound.
Well, let's look back at the boundaries we discussed earlier. The ironclad contract required for safety. In a VTC setting, those physical boundaries just evaporate.
They do.
If I am facilitating a group in a physical office and a client begins experiencing a severe psychological crisis or a panic attack, I am there to intervene. I control the environment. In a digital group, if a client decompensates, they are alone in their room.
Which necessitates an entirely new tier of contracting. Facilitators running VTC groups must have comprehensive verified backup protocols in place. They need local emergency contact numbers, addresses, and crisis intervention plans for every single member on the grid.
And then we must confront the illusion of privacy. A client might be sitting in their bedroom wearing noise-canceling headphones, looking at a secure, high-pay compliance software platform, and feeling completely confident that the session is confidential.
But the facilitator has absolutely no way of knowing if the client's roommate, or maybe an abusive domestic partner, is sitting just out of the camera's frame, listening to every single vulnerability being shared.
It's terrifying. The structural integrity of the group container is entirely reliant on the unseen environment of the client.
And the dynamics become even more volatile when we step away from live video and look at text-based internet chat boards and asynchronous bulletin boards.
Because these function essentially as 247 continuous support groups.
Right. And the distinct advantage here is that members are not put on the spot. They can spend an hour carefully crafting, editing, and fine-tuning their narrative before they hit publish.
They can present exactly the version of themselves they want to share.
But that curation comes at a massive clinical cost. The lack of real-time physical feedback loops severely destabilizes the interaction. When you communicate exclusively through text, you strip away tone of voice, facial microexpressions, posture, and pacing.
And without those critical data points, the human brain just fills in the blanks.
Yes, people begin making massive, unchecked assumptions about the intent of the person typing the message.
They project all of their own insecurities, historical traumas, and biases onto a few lines of text on a screen.
Precisely. And because the social inhibitions of physical presence are absent, this projection rapidly leads to regressive behaviors. Members engage in flaming, aggressive attacking, and severe scapegoating.
So what began as a small, focused support network can instantaneously morph into a chaotic, large group dynamic.
It becomes driven by deep, unconscious cultural forces, tribalism, and mob mentality. The therapeutic value disintegrates rapidly because there is no present facilitator to effectively reframe the interaction in real time.
It is a stark warning about the limitations of digital connection. Wow. We have covered a tremendous expanse of psychological territory today.
We really have.
Let's synthesize the core insights of this journey. We began by examining how the structured curriculum of psychoeducation and the deep present-moment processing of counseling groups serve as a powerful, necessary antidote to the isolation of modern life. We looked at how skilled facilitators construct a safe psychological crucible, actively managing the complex stroke economy and negotiating contracts from an adult ego state.
And we then explored how these foundational architectures must be radically customized for different developmental stages. We saw the necessity of play therapy for children who require a proxy to express their discouragement, and the effectiveness of pragmatic reality therapy for adolescents grappling with emerging existential dread.
We traced the rigorous 5-stage progression of treating addiction, highlighting the crucial mechanism of reframing to combat the destructive power of shame.
And finally, we confronted the collision of these deeply human tribal needs with the expanding digital frontier, balancing the unprecedented access of telehealth against the perilous loss of physical boundaries and the dangers of text-based projection.
As we conclude this deep dive, I really want you, the listener, to analyze your own environment. Consider the various groups you participate in daily, your family structure, your professional teams, your social circles. Are you operating under an explicit, mutually understood contract or just an unwritten set of assumptions? Examine your own stroke economy. What kind of games are you playing to secure recognition? And most importantly, in any given week, how frequently do you engage in true, unmediated, device-free, interpersonal connection?
It is arguably the most vital question of our time. Because if the entirety of our source material points to one undeniable truth, it is that our deepest psychological wounds can only be healed through intimate, accountable, here-and-now connection with other human beings. Which leaves us with a profound societal question.
What is that?
What is the long-term psychological impact on a culture that is rapidly replacing these small, deeply accountable physical circles with anonymous, boundaryless online forums? Are we desperately attempting to innovate our way out of the exact type of uncomfortable human friction that is biologically required for us to actually heal?
And if we don't find a way to reclaim that friction, are we just going to remain seated at that restaurant table, staring silently at our glowing screens, completely oblivious as the cold, muddy waters of our own isolation continue to rise around us?